There is no grave, no auction lot, no barn find waiting to happen. Somewhere in America right now, there is a collector who owns a 1950s Ferrari with mismatched stampings, a 70s muscle car with a replaced engine, a pre-war roadster with a questionable title history. Collectors accept imperfection because imperfection is what survival looks like. The alternative is nothing. For one particular car, General Motors made sure the alternative was nothing. The Smithsonian Institution in Washington holds one surviving example. It sits behind a barrier. Visitors can see it. Nobody can start it. Before GM donated the car to the National Museum, the company rendered its drivetrain inoperable. It was not a museum piece that happened to be non-functional. It was a machine that was specifically prepared to be permanently non-functional before it left GM's possession. A running car made into a statue. The only one the public can see anywhere in the country, and it was neutered before anyone could ask whether it still worked. General Motors built over 1,100 of these cars. It retained legal ownership of every single one through a structure it had designed from the beginning to guarantee that outcome. When the program ended, it sent letters. It collected the cars. It destroyed them. General Motors did not lose track of these cars. It knew exactly where every one of them was, and it went and got them back. To understand why a corporation would spend approximately $1 billion developing a technology, prove that the technology worked, build a community of drivers who described the result as the finest car they had ever operated, and then systematically repossess and crush every unit in the fleet, you have to understand what American cities looked like in 1990 and what American corporations stood to lose if the technology succeeded. Los Angeles in the late 1980s was not a city with an air quality problem in the way that phrase is used casually. It was a city whose physicians were publishing data about respiratory damage in children, whose summer days were governed by ozone advisories, and whose air was measurably among the worst in the industrialized world. The California Air Resources Board was not an ideological organization. It was a regulatory body responding to numbers that physicians and atmospheric scientists had already published. In 1990, it passed a zero-emission vehicle mandate, requiring that 2% of vehicles sold in California by major manufacturers produce zero tailpipe emissions by 1998, rising to 10% by 2003. These were not voluntary targets. They were conditions of doing business in the largest automotive market in the United States. General Motors understood the mandate immediately. What it also understood, and what the public discussion of the mandate rarely acknowledged, was that an electric vehicle was not merely a different kind of car. It was a different kind of business. A gasoline-powered vehicle contains hundreds of components that wear, fail, and require replacement on predictable schedules. The dealership service department exists because those components exist. The parts distribution network exists because those components exist. The revenue that flows to a manufacturer after the initial sale exists because those components exist. An electric vehicle eliminates most of them. Fewer moving parts means fewer service appointments. Fewer service appointments means less dealership revenue. Less dealership revenue means less of the post-sale income stream that American automotive business models had been built around for decades. GM entered the electric vehicle program publicly, aggressively, and with what appeared to be genuine institutional commitment. That appearance was not false at the beginning. The car that became the EV1 did not begin as a compliance exercise. It began with a race. In 1987, General Motors commissioned a solar-powered vehicle for an Australian long-distance race called the World Solar Challenge. The power electronic system for that vehicle was designed by Alan Cocconi, working at the time as a contractor. The car won its race by a margin so complete that competitors questioned the results. What Cocconi had built was not a novelty. It was a demonstration that electric propulsion, managed correctly, could produce performance that combustion engine vehicles could not match in the conditions that favored it. 3 years later, at the 1990 Los Angeles Auto Show, GM chairman Roger Smith stood next to a concept vehicle called the Impact and told the audience that General Motors would build it. This was not a routine auto show promise, hedged with phrases like subject to market conditions and production details to be determined. It was a chairman-level public commitment, on record, in front of cameras, with a production timeline attached. The Impact was not a golf cart in sports car clothing. Independent journalists who drove the prototype reported 0 to 60 miles per hour in under 9 seconds, an aerodynamic drag coefficient lower than any production vehicle then available anywhere in the world, and a driving experience they described as genuinely quick rather than theoretically acceptable. Cocconi's AC induction motor control system, which allowed regenerative braking and produced the specific power delivery characteristics that made the car feel urgent from a standing start, was the engineering achievement that made all of it possible. The technology was real. The chairman had made the promise in public. General Motors had not yet built the EV1, but the EV1 was already inevitable. Robert Stempel succeeded Roger Smith as GM chairman in 1990, the same year the Impact was unveiled and the CARB mandate passed. He authorized the program's formal development under the production name EV1. By documented accounts, Stempel was a genuine advocate for the technology, rather than an executive managing a regulatory obligation. He ran the program as a product development effort, rather than a compliance exercise, which meant it received the kind of internal resources and institutional attention that made the difference between a car that worked and a car that merely existed. In 1992, GM's outside directors moved against him. The corporation's financial position had deteriorated, and the board acted. Stempel departed. The specific language in most accounts describes it as a resignation. The specific context is that he had exhausted his runway with a board that had decided he was not the solution to GM's problems. He was replaced by Jack Smith. The EV1 program continued because the CARB mandate required it to continue, and because public commitments had been made at a level of visibility that cancellation would have made embarrassing. But the character of the institutional commitment shifted. The program was funded. It was staffed. It proceeded. What it no longer had was a chairman who had staked his personal credibility on its success. The EV1 launched in 1996, available exclusively through Saturn dealerships in California and Arizona, exclusively through lease, never for purchase. GM presented the lease-only structure publicly as a customer service decision. The technology was new, the infrastructure was developing, and a lease protected customers from uncertainty. Every word of that was defensible. It was also a structure that guaranteed GM retained legal ownership of every vehicle in the fleet, which meant that when the program ended, GM had the contractual right to demand every car back. Chelsea Sexton was not a critic of the EV1 program. She was a GM employee, part of the team assigned to market and support it. She was inside the institution, doing the job GM had hired her to do, building exactly the kind of customer loyalty that any car company describes as a success metric. What she built was a community of drivers who had come to depend on the car, drivers who described it as the finest car they had ever operated. Drivers who, when told the program was ending and the cars were being recalled, did not quietly return them. The community Sexton had built became the most visible opposition to the program's termination, which is a specific kind of institutional irony. GM had hired someone to make people love the EV1, and then had to deal with the consequences of how well she had done her job. The waiting list for the EV1 at various points during the program exceeded the total number of units produced. People were waiting for a car that was not available for purchase. GM's internal market research generated an estimate of total addressable demand of fewer than 4,700 units nationwide. Sources conflict on how that figure was derived. EV1 advocates and independent analysts have argued it was methodologically constructed to produce a predetermined result rather than to measure actual demand. What is documented is the collision between that figure and the reality of a waiting list longer than the total production run, generated for a car that no one could actually buy outright. GM's demand analysis and the waiting list cannot both be correct. One of them reflects the market. The other reflects what the institution needed the market to be. Beginning in the late 1990s, the Western States Petroleum Association and a coalition of automakers that included General Motors filed legal challenges against the CARB-ZEV mandate, arguing it exceeded the agency's regulatory authority. GM was simultaneously operating an electric vehicle program and funding litigation designed to eliminate the regulatory requirement that had created that program. In 2001, under sustained industry pressure, CARB amended the mandate, reducing near-term electric vehicle obligations and allowing hydrogen fuel cell vehicles to count toward compliance. GM announced it would not renew EV1 leases. The objection that will arrive in the comment section is worth addressing directly here, because it is the argument most likely to be made, and because it is not entirely wrong. The EV1's real-world range was a legitimate constraint. First-generation units delivered roughly 70 miles between charges under typical conditions, less in cold weather, less at highway speeds. For a significant portion of American drivers, that was not a usable car in 1996. The charging infrastructure that would make electric vehicles genuinely convenient for average use did not exist yet, and would not exist for another decade and a half. The technology had limits. Acknowledging those limits does not require defending what came next. What came next was not a program that was wound down because the technology fell short. The drivers who had the cars did not find them inadequate. They requested to purchase them. They offered full estimated market value. GM refused every purchase request without exception, not because the price was wrong, but because the car's continued existence in private hands was not what the institution wanted. The waiting list that exceeded 4,700 people was not a list of buyers willing to accept a 70-mile range vehicle with limited charging options. It was a list of buyers who had evaluated those constraints and decided the car was worth having anyway. GM's market research said those buyers did not exist in sufficient numbers. The waiting list said they were already there. The repossessions followed the lease expirations in sequence. GM sent termination notices. Some drivers attempted to negotiate. Some organized. A group of EV1 lessees staged a documented protest outside a GM facility in Burbank, California, when a portion of the fleet was transported there. They maintained the vigil for days. Some had driven their own leased cars to the facility and sat with them, occupying the space the cars would have occupied at a funeral. It was documented. It was ignored. The cars were transported to a facility in Arizona. They were destroyed. A small number of units were donated to museums and universities with drivetrains rendered permanently inoperable prior to transfer. The Smithsonian received one. It cannot be started. GM made sure of that before it left their possession. The mechanism this time was not a policy directive about engine displacement. It was not a platform consolidation decision. It was not a cost assessment that found the price too high to justify against a competitor's sticker. The mechanism was the lease structure itself, the legal instrument GM had designed before the first EV1 reached a driveway. The committee had not said no to the EV1. It had said yes, carefully, in a way that guaranteed it could say no later, completely, and retrieve every piece of evidence that the yes had ever happened. The mechanism changed. The outcome did not. General Motors got what it wanted in 2003. The cars were gone. The waiting list had nowhere to go. The institutional argument had been made and enforced at the level of the crusher. What the institution did not account for was everyone who had driven one. Chelsea Sexton did not return to a different industry after the program ended. She continued working in electric vehicle advocacy, carrying the knowledge she had built inside GM's own program into the broader effort that pushed electrification forward without GM's cooperation or institutional support. The community she had built inside GM's marketing apparatus became the foundation of the advocacy ecosystem that outlasted the program by years and outlasted GM's institutional resistance by a decade. Tesla Motors was incorporated in 2003, the same calendar year GM finished destroying the cars that had proved the market existed. A new company incorporated to build electric vehicles for that market opened its doors. The causal connection is not directly documented and should not be overstated. The timing does not require overstatement. By 2009, General Motors had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, the largest industrial bankruptcy in American history. The restructuring plan included federal funds and a commitment to electrification that required GM to rebuild, at enormous expense, the engineering knowledge base it had systematically discarded when it destroyed the EV1 fleet. The corporation that had spent approximately $1 billion proving the technology worked spent the following decade paying to relearn what it had already known, competing against manufacturers who had built on the foundation GM had abandoned, in a market whose existence GM's own research had said was insufficient to justify the program it had just finished crushing. The Smithsonian car sits behind its barrier. Its drivetrain is inoperable. It is the only surviving EV1 in the world that a member of the public can stand in front of. It cannot be restored. GM made sure of that before it left their possession. It is, in its current condition, precisely what GM wanted every EV1 to become. A thing that exists only as evidence that a thing existed. Not a machine. A record. GM got what it wanted. It did not get the last word. If this is the kind of story that deserves to be told, subscribe and drop a comment below telling us which suppressed technology, which erased program, or which decision an institution made and spent the next 20 years regretting you want covered next. We read everyone. The next video starts down there.